Welcome back. Our next speaker is Charles Calhoun. Charles is an independent scholar who lives here in Bristol. A native of Louisiana, he has spent most of his adult life in New England. Charles is best known for two books, A Small College in Maine, 200 Years of Bowdoin, in which he traces the close link between Maine's identity and the growth of its best-known college, and Longfellow, A Rediscovered Life, in which he examines how the best-known American poet in the 19th century became one of the least read in the 20th. Charles studied history at the University of Virginia and law at Christ Church, Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is currently working on a book about Walt Whitman in the Civil War.
Yes. Well, again, thank you, Renee. I just wanted to mention that Renee also has a Virginia connection. She did her undergraduate work at Mary Washington University in Fredericksburg, and back in the bad old days, boys went to UVA, girls went to Mary Washington, and I know that's changed, but I do think she may feel some resonance from some of the things I have to say to you today about the South, the Old South, and maybe a New South. So the question I want to pose in my talk this afternoon is, why does Robert Penn Warren take this Civil War story about a Mississippi soldier named Cass Mastern and insert it as chapter 4 of his novel? This has puzzled many readers. Some people just skip over it. Others enjoy it as a story in itself without connecting it to the bigger picture. No less than William Faulkner said that the Cass Mastern material should have been the novel that Warren should have written, not the political melodrama of Willie Stark. It was, in fact, published separately as a short story in 1944 in the Partisan Review, but it was billed even then as an excerpt from a much longer novel. The episode only takes up about 50 pages in the paperback edition of 661 pages that we're using. And I'm not arguing that it's absolutely central to this novel with so many overlapping strands of plot. But I think if Warren had left it out, we would be at a disadvantage, because I do think it helps us understand Jack Burton. Incidentally, I find Jack a very irritating character. Some people have compared him to Doug Stampler in the American version of House of Cards. I think they come from a different social background. And in fact, it's Jack's sense of well-born privilege and his penchant for sometimes sophomoric philosophizing that I think irritates me a bit. But still, I don't think Robert Penn Warren put him there by accident. But before I get started on that, trying to answer that particular question, I wanted to say something on a more personal note, and that's how thrilled I am to be talking about Willie Stark as well. He's loosely based on Huey Long, although the real Long was a far more complex and more intelligent and even more disturbing character than his fictional counterpart. You just heard that I grew up in Louisiana, in northern Louisiana, a place called Monroe. And in the 1950s, which that was 20 years after Long's assassination, in the 1950s, the world of my childhood was filled with his name. Everywhere you looked, there was a highway, a bridge, a hospital, a university that he had built. Robert Penn Warren was teaching at LSU, the state university, from 1933 to 1942, because Huey Long had pumped so much money into it. He wanted to build a world-class English department there in Baton Rouge. That's something I can't quite see Willie Stark being interested in, but they did share a fascination and obsession, one could say an obsession, with the football team. Huey Long poured a lot of money into the LSU Tigers, as well as the English department. He was determined that his state university would be huge, and he was willing to pay for it. I also want to mention some family connections. My maternal grandfather grew up with Huey Long in the piney woods of central Louisiana in a town called Winfield. One of them became a doctor, the other became a lawyer. My mother, when she was at LSU, and was a good friend of Huey's daughter, Rose. In fact, my mother told a story once of being in the Long's kitchen, and the 10-year-old Russell Long, Rose's younger brother, was standing on a chair and practicing an oration. He had seen his father orate and heard his father orate, and he wanted to follow in the family tradition, and he was getting a very early start. Of course, he went on to 39 years in the US Senate, 15 of them as chair of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. You'll be hearing some more about that tomorrow from George Shipley. My childhood was also full of news about Huey's younger brother, Crazy Earl Long, a 3-term governor of Louisiana. There is a wonderful Paul Newman film I would highly recommend called Blaze, came out in 1989. And it's about the Bourbon Street stripper, Blaze Starr, that Earl had a fling with before he was institutionalized, and not for the first or last time. So Earl was quite a character. And there were other Longs in the background in all kinds of public office. But this Long dynasty, or machine, if you prefer to call it that, didn't really end until the 1960s and early 70s, when the Solid South melted and turned Republican red following LBJ's civil rights legislation. My grandparents were also close to another Winfield boy, Oscar K. Allen, who followed Huey as governor. Everyone called him OK Allen, supposedly because whatever Huey asked him to do, he'd say, okay. Earl Long liked to tell a story about him. Huey Long built this skyscraper state capitol that still dominates the landscape in Baton Rouge, a beautiful Art Deco building, all kinds of marble and brass inside. And Earl Long's story is that OK Allen was sitting in the governor's office there with the window open one day, and he saw a leaf blow in, and it landed on his desk. He immediately signed it, thinking it was another bill Huey had just pushed through the legislature. Huey, by then, was a US senator, much in the national news as he took on Franklin Roosevelt, but he still ran the state in a very hands-on fashion. He literally, during legislative sessions, he would stalk up and down the aisles and look over people's shoulders, see how they're voting, pass out envelopes of money, that sort of thing. And he also kept an apartment on the 34th floor of the Capitol. Ironically, the lobby of the Capitol was where he would be assassinated in 1935 at age 42, and he's buried on its grounds. So just a little bit of family background as to why I find the Longs so fascinating. I've rewritten a talk that I would have given had we met last March, and I want to put my question about Cass Mastern in the context of current changes in our own country, changes that are still very much underway, that are works in progress, but changes in our understanding of how we remember the Confederacy, the cause that Cass Mastern, of course, gives his life to serve. I've been enormously helped in this by Michael Gora's new book, The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War. Gora is a colleague of Alex's at Smith, and I hope she will tell him I think it's a wonderful book, and I've learned all kinds of things from it. He writes about what an enormous shadow the 1861-65 war of rebellion on the part of the Southern whites cast over all of Faulkner's own fiction, and what an unescapable influence Faulkner had on all the Southern writers of Warren's generation and even after. In many respects, even someone as unlike Faulkner as Toni Morrison continues very much where he left off. So I know this is a program about Robert Penn Warren, but I do want to say a little bit about Faulkner because he is such a key figure in all of this. Faulkner not only invents Southern Gothic, or as some people prefer to call it, plantation porn, he is the greatest American novelist of the 20th century. Indeed, the only American novelist ever, except maybe for Melville, who can stand as an equal with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Dickens and Austen and Proust and Thomas Mann as among the greatest figures in the Western tradition of the novel. The French caught on to his greatness far more quickly than we did. They were already praising him in the 1930s and 40s. And it is impossible to imagine Hispanic American literature of the 20th century, for example, without what he taught them about the possibilities of magic realism. I think particularly of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude in that regard. I mention all this because I think Faulkner's Civil War and Warren's overlap in interesting ways. And I suspect Warren was always resisting that influence. It wasn't exactly Oedipal. They were only 8 years apart in age. So it wasn't a father-son conflict. In fact, it was the appearance in 1946 of the portable William Faulkner, an anthology that really introduced his work to a large American public. That publication sealed and secured his reputation forever since. And that, of course, was the same year in which Warren publishes All the King's Men. By nice coincidence, also the year I appeared, and I expect some of you did too. It's a cliche to say that the Civil War has never ended. It would be far truer to say that Reconstruction never ended. It was suspended, yes, abandoned, misrepresented by its enemies. It was a failure whose consequences still afflict us. I want to read just a line from Gora's book in support of that. He's talking about those statues of Confederate soldiers that you see in every courthouse square in the South. He says these monuments remind us that we must always remember memorials that we should never forget, but what does such a statue ask us to remember? And what does that memory require we forget? In Faulkner's day, the white South littered its public spaces with the mementos of its own ruined cause, deployed a sense of its own suffering, and mastered the rhetoric of victimhood and hatred alike. And indeed, its peoples were victims of what they had done to themselves. They were also perpetrators. And it goes on to mention the evils of slavery. But he goes on beyond that to say that denial was not limited to the South. It belonged to much of white America, the country in which the blue and the gray became one. So let me very quickly review a few of the events that I referred to in the last 6 months. Some of these changes were already in the works. For example, if you visit Monticello today, you don't hear references to the house servants. They actually admit that they were slaves, and they will even show you Sally Hemings's room. Calhoun College at Yale and Calhoun Lake in Minneapolis have already been renamed. I think it was about time. UVA has its large-scale monument to the enslaved workers who built Mr. Jefferson's University and who kept it running in the antebellum era. Sewanee, the University of the South in the beautiful hills of eastern Tennessee, that shrine of white Southern memory, this September renounced its Confederate past. There was a vote of the Board of Regents, and they vowed to become a much more diverse institution. The city of Richmond is still struggling with what to do with Monument Avenue, that Valhalla of Confederate heroes. All of these changes were overdue. Many of them are still contested, but it took a distinct shift in public opinion to make them happen. And I think that shift has occurred since last March for a number of reasons. For example, there's been a generation of first-rate historical scholarship on the true nature of slavery, although it was somewhat slow in trickling down to the general public. But I think the historical truth is finally sinking in. The root cause of the Civil War was slavery, not states' rights or local pride or Southern Scotch-Irish orneriness, but the institution of slavery itself and the theories of white racial superiority that justified it. Let me emphasize that this was not just a Southern problem, as Gora has also suggested. As citizens of Bristol have found out in trying to uncover the truth about this town's slave trading wealth, the North was deeply implicated in this national sin. Northern banks, insurance companies, colleges and universities, churches, the whole New England textile industry with all its need for Southern cotton and Southern markets all bear a share of the guilt. More recently, thanks to Black Lives Matter and the horrendous events in Charlottesville 2 summers ago, and the continuing state-sanctioned violence against innocent Black men and women in this country, there's been a national effort to re-examine public expressions of pro-Confederate sympathy and lost cause commemoration. Even in as quiet a place as Bristol, a small Black Lives Matter presence and modest demonstrations seem to have caused panic on the part not only of just a few angry old white men, but others who should have known better, yet felt their lifetime of white privilege being questioned. Some sort of backlash was to be expected, but it has a more troubling side. Suddenly it's respectable, at least in some quarters, to be quite publicly racist. That wasn't the case a few years ago, I don't think, or 4 years ago, certainly. It's sanctioned at the highest levels of our current government. Recently, the junior senator from Arkansas said slavery had been, quote, a necessary evil, unquote. His name, Tom Cotton. You couldn't make things like that up. So that's the background in brief. I could go on and on. I'm sure you have your own list of examples, but that's the background against which I want to examine the Cass Mastern story. Since it may have been a few months since you read the novel, let me very quickly retell the episode, leaving out most of the details, but to try to give you the gist of it. Jack inherits from an ancestor of his father's, or the man he thinks is his father, a set of Civil War memorabilia. It includes a journal, some letters, a record book, a photograph, and a gold wedding ring. And as he examines this cache of materials that comes into his possession, the photograph particularly catches his eye. He, in the words of the narrator, Cass's pair of dark, wide-set, deep eyes burned out of the photograph through the dinginess and dust. It was probably a daguerreotype, on a piece of on a metal plate. And as you shift the plate, the light catches on the ridges, and the face comes alive. The eyes would have beamed forth. So it suggests a very dramatic encounter between Cass Mastern and his young descendant, Jack Burden. It also brings to mind something John Burt said yesterday about Emerson's famous transparent eyeball. And not to be too obvious about it, it says something maybe about Warren's own anxiety about blindness. We learned yesterday about his loss of one eye in an accident. And I think that perhaps that made him all the more sensitive to the power of sight. Cass Mastern is a rich young man from Mississippi who goes off to college in Lexington, Kentucky at Transylvania College. And there he falls into the fast set of other young men, privileged young men, who are into horse racing and gambling and drinking and wenching and what have you. And he forms a very strong bond, a very strong friendship with one of them, a man who becomes a young banker named Duncan Trice. And in the course of a few years, this all happens in the mid-1850s, Trice takes him home to his plantation in Kentucky and introduces him to his very beguiling young wife, Annabelle. And for some time, the three of them get along very, very well, frequent visits, many dinners, long talks in the night, et cetera, et cetera. But because of the nature of his business, Duncan also often has to be away out of town, away from the plantation. So Cass and Annabelle are thrown together more frequently. And you can imagine what happens. They begin a torrid relationship and conducted in all through various parts of the plantation, house and grounds. And they think no one notices. Of course, all the slaves know exactly what's going on, but they keep their mouths shut equally, obviously. But the day finally comes when Duncan returns and he picks up the gossip somehow from the slave quarters about this. And he goes off to the summer house, I believe it was, and he shoots himself. But he does it in a way to make it look like it's an accident that he's had while cleaning his pistol. That evening, the young African-American woman, a very light-skinned African-American woman, who is Annabelle's favorite servant, domestic servant, she's in the bedroom and she is making up the marital bed, what had been the marital bed. And underneath the bolster, she discovers Duncan's gold wedding ring. And she rather dramatically presents it to her mistress. The mistress immediately has a furious attack. She realizes that her husband has put it there as a sign to her that he knows that he's been betrayed by her and his best friend. And she also knows that Phoebe has figured this out, and presumably everyone else working in the house and beyond. So in a fury, she not only breaks up her relationship with Cass, but she also sells Phoebe down the river, the Ohio River in this case, but eventually the Mississippi, down to New Orleans, where presumably she'll be sold into being a prostitute in a New Orleans brothel. Cass has a huge guilt attack upon learning of all this. And I think he's glad to be rid of Annabelle, but he is very concerned about what has happened to Phoebe, who is a very independent and admirable young woman in many ways, and he realizes what a terrible blow this is to her. So he sets up trying to find her, and he visits the various slave traders, and talks one after another all the way to New Orleans, and he never finds her. She disappears from the story and from any kind of record. He, meanwhile, goes back to his own plantation, broods for a while, takes up the study of the law. He decides to free his own slaves. He tries employing them as wage laborers for a bit. That doesn't work out. He finally tells them, just, get on the boat, I'm sending you north. North would probably mean Cincinnati in this context, and we never hear of them again. Meanwhile, the Civil War is brewing, and he joins in 1861 the Mississippi Rifles. But along with many of his friends and compatriots, he joins as a private, and he has one condition. He will march with the army, and he will carry a rifle, but he will not shoot anyone with it. And for some reason or another, this is accepted. Maybe it's just regarded as eccentricity. But in the course of the war, he manages to survive several major battles and many skirmishes. But in 1865, he is wounded in the leg, and he dies of gangrene a few months later in an Atlanta hospital. So that's the Cass Mastern episode, the story that is embedded into Robert Penn Warren's novel. Now, I have 6 things I want to point out about this story very quickly. The first is, some people find it's improbable that the Masterns became rich so quickly. It's the older brother, Gilbert, who really has all the money and who's the entrepreneurial one. He loses the money in the Civil War, but gains it back afterwards in railroads and banking and what have you. But this is very much a typical Mississippi story in the 1830s and 40s. There was all this very rich Delta land waiting to be turned over to cotton production. And if you had enough capital to invest in a few slaves, you could buy the land very cheaply. And not overnight, but of course, in maybe 3, 4, 5 years, you could become very rich indeed, because cotton was the great moneymaker of the day. A bit like sugar in the 18th century in Barbados, or oil in the 20th century in Texas and Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. So the family makes this money, and if you go to places like Natchez today, you see these beautiful plantation houses, all built by first-generation wealth coming out of this Delta agriculture. And the Delta, when I say the Delta, you probably know this, but just in case not, it's the floodplain of the Mississippi from Memphis to Natchez on both sides of the river, Mississippi and Louisiana. Richest agricultural soil in the world, some people say. The second thing is that we learn in the story that Cass has been educated by a Presbyterian tutor, a tubercular young man from Princeton, New Jersey. So we get this hint that the very heavy hand of Calvinism has been laid on him at an impressionable age, which may explain his exaggerated sense of guilt. The third thing is the importance of Phoebe. There is no other Black character in the novel, as far as I know, who has the sense of agency that she has. There's no other Black character to speak of. There are Black people in the background, and the N word is used a lot. But she's the one who really stands out and gets Warren's attention. Of course, it's her eyes, again, the eyes. It's her eyes that torment her mistress, Annabelle, because she looks at her so accusingly. The fourth thing is that on Warren's part, there was no hint of romanticizing or sanitizing slavery. This is unlike some other more traditional Southern writers of his day, and certainly unlike the author Gone with the Wind. But Warren instead, it really does express its horror. The way that families are torn apart because Phoebe has a kind of common law husband on another plantation. She will never see him again. It's the sadism of even quote unquote kind masters. It's the treatment of the Black female body in particular as a field of white male enjoyment. Mary Chestnut, in her fascinating diary from Civil War Richmond, tells the story of the plantation wives who would visit each other's homes, and they would always comment afterwards on how much the children looked like some of the servants, the slaves, except for their own families. and you can take it from there. The fifth thing is the improbability of Cass Masterson's war. There were conscientious objectors in the Civil War. Faulkner writes about one of them, Goodhue Coalfield. He's the shopkeeper in Absalom, who nails himself shut in his attic and slowly starves himself to death. But whether someone like Cass Masterson could get away with not firing his rifle, it just doesn't sound plausible. You'd be putting the people on either side of you in danger. I just don't think it happened. Unless they just regarded him as a kind of holy fool in the Dostoevskian sense of that term and tolerated him. And finally, maybe this is most important, I want to point out the way that the Cass Masterson episode brackets the novel. We first meet Jack when he is playing it, being a graduate student, blocked from completing his project of turning the Cass Masterson material into a book, into the thesis that would become a book. He has all the facts there, but he doesn't yet know what they all add up to. He can't extract some meaning from them. At the end of the novel, we find him returning to this research, eager to complete his book at last, and maybe, we don't know what, maybe go off to be a college professor himself. Although I'm a bit skeptical that his marriage to Anne is really going to work. It's hard to imagine her serving hot chocolate and cookies to the students. And I think this is something that came up yesterday. Are we really going to take Cass Masterson as a reliable narrator of his own story? I'll leave that thought with you. So putting all that together, this embedded episode from the Civil War operates as a kind of quest narrative. Jack is a young man who has a goal, writing this book, but he's thwarted. He must go through a series of trials involving dragons and monsters and evil dwarfs of one kind or another, but he emerges at the end, wiser if battle-scarred, with his prize, a book within reach. Now, a more standard interpretation of the episode is that its adulterous triangle, Duncan, Annabelle, Cass, reflects other such triangles in the novel. Jack's mother, the scholarly attorney, Judge Irwin, Willie's wife, Sadie Burke, Willie, Sadie, and Stanton. And so you could work all that out, whether these are echoes of each other or they're supposed to connect in some way. It's one interesting approach to the story. And we also, as you heard yesterday in Professor Burt's dazzling presentation, the unforgettable role the spider's web metaphor plays in the uncertain progress of Jack's moral education across the stretch of this novel. He learns in the most immediate sort of way about the law of unintended consequences. So I suppose my answer to that question I first posed about why the story is there comes down to another question. Could Robert Penn Warren have written a novel set in the Deep South in the 1920s and 30s that did not have something to say about the Civil War, even if that war had ended 60 years earlier? So let's speculate a bit. We know a lot about Warren's early association. He was 17 years old in 1922 when he took up with a group of, he was obviously a very bright and obviously talented undergraduate. He took up with a group of older poets and professors known as the Fugitives. That was the name of the literary magazine they published at that point. And he continued his allegiance to them as they developed into a group called the Nashville Agrarians. He was a contributor to their famous manifesto, I'll Take My Stand. And while I think he quickly outgrew their romanticizing of the Old South, he still shared their belief in the importance of a deep connection to the soil, the value of a sense of tradition, the dignity of human labor, the importance of the local and the authentic. All this in the face of a noisy, crude, soul-destroying 1920s modernity, a modernity associated with the industrial and urban North. So South good, North bad, and this is the reason why. I'll Take My Stand came out in 1930, just as the Depression was proving that capitalism might not have been all it was cracked up to be after all. At the same time, we heard yesterday about Warren's own progressive politics. From the 1950s on, he was an outspoken Southern liberal, even if he did not seem that interested as a writer in the actual lives of Black fellow Southerners. This was perhaps because he grew up in Guthrie, Kentucky, in the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, very much outside the plantation world of the Cotton Kingdom, for he was certainly intensely interested in the lives of the poor whites he had known as a child. This comes through in his other fiction and his poetry. There's an interesting parallel with Huey Long here. He was the only Southern demagogue of his time who didn't play the race card, who didn't seem to be obsessed with the notion of keeping Black people down. And we can say maybe this grows out of his own childhood in impoverished Wynn Parish, Louisiana, Winfield being the county seat, the parish seat. It had been a Unionist stronghold in the years just before the Civil War, in other words, opposed to secession. And it likewise, its economy, its culture, its way of life was very much outside the riches of the Cotton Kingdom in the Delta. So finally, how does this history, or rather this reinterpretation of the Lost Causes false history, shape how we read the Cass-Mastern chapter today? Is it a Civil War commemoration? Has Robert Penn Warren erected a statue, not of a Confederate general, but of a common soldier? And does it need tearing down or moving into a museum or demythologizing in some sense? It seems to me Cass-Mastern is a hero who isn't a hero, but becomes one by not being one. He's not your stereotypical Johnny Reb, breathing fire, brandishing his Bowie knife, daring you to come at him. You see this in some of these period photographs of Confederates. He's someone who drains himself of himself. In theological terms, he empties himself. The technical word for this is kenosis, a Greek word, kenosis. In the paradoxical sense that Christ empties himself in order to become human, according to this theology, and the Christian empties herself in order to be filled with God. What flows out is ego, ambition, guile, self-centeredness, arrogance, certainty, pride. What replaces it is a state of grace. Now, this notion is far more influential in Eastern Orthodoxy, by the way, than it is in Western Christianity, where it seems sometimes that everyone is far too often puffing themselves up rather than emptying themselves out. But that's the story for another day. So Cass-Mastern's self-inflicted martyrdom in battle is of this nature. But does it make him a saint? Whether he fires his weapon or not, he is still marching with his fellow white Mississippians, tied by some tribal bond, sacrificing himself to the hallowed cause of the white Southern way of life, which is the realm of suffering and abuse, and in Faulkner's world, death for those with one drop of Black blood in their veins. Yet Cass-Mastern says that he comes to wear his gray jacket, the jacket that Jack sees in the photograph, in the daguerreotype. He wears his gray jacket with pride. So what do we make of that? Please don't misunderstand me, though. I'm not saying we should somehow erase the Cass-Mastern story from Warren's great novel, or similar episodes from anyone else's work. I'm not for throwing out Coal Mountain or the wonderful letters of Mary Chestnut, or Cable's Old Creole Days, or the poetry of Sidney Lanier out the library window. On the contrary, I'm saying that we should read them in a new light, aware of the ways the Confederate legacy, Southern heritage, as some people, including most of my family and ancestors, would have insisted on calling it, how Southern heritage has been used and misused in our culture to defend things that are indefensible, to make things seem normal that were in fact twisted and exploitative and shameful, and as destructive in their own way to the people who were the slave owners as to the slaves themselves. We need to be always alert to these manipulations of truth, always suspicious of those championing them. So I don't really have an answer for you as to whether Cass-Mastern is a piece of lost cause propaganda, in the sense that Gone with the Wind certainly is, and, Margaret Mitchell's great bestseller, or The Birth of a Nation, the great D.W. Griffith film, which is based on Thomas Dixon's novel about the Klan, or even the sense that maybe Shelby Foote in Ken Burns' Civil War series, that his presence there is a sort of piece, a very more subtle, of course, and more nuanced, but is itself a piece of lost cause propaganda. And we can all think of other examples. I don't doubt for a moment that Warren's own progressive views on race, or the courage it took for a white Southerner to express such views in his lifetime, is something to be admired. I just want you to think about these things and bring them up tomorrow in the closing discussion. We'll have an hour to hear from all of you, as well as from our presenters. So thank you very much for listening to this, and it's been a pleasure to be with you here today. And if you have any questions, we have some time. I have one question that's come up. What happened to Cass Mastern's slaves after he freed them and put them on the boat? We don't know. That was something in the fictive world that wasn't explained to us. We do know, and it would have been very rare in antebellum times because slaves were such a huge capital investment. So we do know that during the Civil War itself, as the Union Army moved through the South, slaves were often freed or just freed themselves when their masters ran away. Sometimes they were treated as contraband of war and therefore could be seized by the Union Army and set free if they wanted to, or put to work, paid work for the army. But in some cases, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, when any enslaved person in any area that the federal troops occupied was declared free, that was a big step. Things did change. And sometimes the news was very slow in traveling, though. Slaves didn't believe that it actually happened. Sometimes their masters lied to them. Sometimes they did realize they were free, but they didn't know where to go. They stayed basically in the places they'd been living. There was some danger if they strayed too far from home that they would be captured by Southerners, white Southerners, and re-enslaved. I mean, who would believe them, the story they told? But we do know that some went north, or some went to New Orleans, which was a city that always had a very large and quite, in some ways, quite prosperous free Black population. Maybe Cass Mastern paid their way to Cincinnati and gave them enough money that they could establish themselves in some fashion there. But it would have been a very difficult thing for all of the talk about the Underground Railroad and all the care that the runaway slaves got. In fact, it was a very difficult thing to pull off. People had very little sense of geography if they'd spent all their lives in an isolated rural plantation, and they just didn't have the resources to travel very far. I'm not saying it didn't happen, it certainly did. Some people got all the way to Canada, but I think Cass Mastern is not doing a kind thing. We might often almost say he's doing something that's evil and self-serving in dismissing any responsibility for these people who have relied on him all their lives. So in brief, that's what might have happened. Yeah, another question is, in the context of the Cass Mastern episode, the passage about him, could I speak something about family memoirs and stories and how they shape the American story? That's a huge subject. I'm not sure I can say anything more. I mean, I told you a little bit of my own family history. And, I'm not sure it was that relevant or interesting, but it does connect with Huey Long. I'm not sure what I'd ever do with it. I do think that, I mentioned Toni Morrison earlier, and she's someone whose extensive oeuvre is very much based on the retelling of the stories of ex-slaves, runaway slaves, recently freed slaves, the next generation of Blacks living both North and South. So in that sense, this is an extraordinarily rich fund of material for any writer. And I think I would add to that during the New Deal, there was the Works Progress Administration, and there were people who traveled in the South, documentarians of one kind or another, historians, genealogists, whatever, and they interviewed a lot of people who had been born in slavery, and most of them were very old by that time, but many of them had very vivid memories. And all this material was recorded and it's been published. And it's a wonderful source of family memory and of often very dramatic and tragic and heartbreaking narratives of what happened to these people and their nearest and dearest. And various writers, I think, particularly in the new generation of African-American novelists, have been able to tap some of that material. Beyond that, I would also just make the obvious comment that Black and white Southerners love to tell stories. And that has been one of the great, the rich ground from which Southern literature, which is one of the great literatures of the world, from which it has grown on the part of both communities. Let's see, maybe, well, another question. Do you yourself support the removal of all lost cause memorabilia and monuments, including the Confederate flag? A very good question. Yes and no. If you want to fly a Confederate flag in your house or put it on your boat or your car or your motorcycle, I think you have an obvious First Amendment right to do so. That's one of the freedoms that we all believe in, I hope. But if you want to keep a statue of a Confederate hero in a public place on a pedestal, in a situation where the descendants of a huge number of once enslaved people have to pass by and look at that statue every day, I think that's a very different issue. And it's the difference between a public monument and some private belief and practice. So I'm all in favor of pulling those sorts of monuments down and not destroying them, but putting them in a museum somewhere, putting some contextual explanation around them. It's a process that's only beginning. The most recent figure I saw, there have been about 106 of these monuments over the South that have been taken down. I think that's probably a very small proportion of the total numbers that are out there. But it gets more complicated. Do you start changing place names? Yes. I say that as someone who went to Robert E. Lee Junior High School in Monroe, Louisiana. And I'm also someone who spent 6 very miserable weeks many years ago at Fort Benning, Georgia, doing basic Army training. And at the time, I had no idea that Fort Benning was named for a Confederate general, famous Georgian. Things like that were just so much a part of the landscape that you didn't think about them. You didn't imagine that anyone would challenge them. But I think that has all changed. And again, this shift of opinion, I think, is happened within the last year, certainly, and it will have enormous repercussions. Another question, a good one. Do you think most people realize that these Confederate monuments were erected decades after the end of the Civil War? Yes, certainly. I don't know that most people, I'm not sure what most people would be, but they were all part of the Lost Cause movement. This was an effort, it started in the immediate years after the Civil War, but it really caught on in the 1880s and 90s. This was an effort often a part of widows and daughters and sisters of the Confederate dead and wounded who faced this problem. The South had experienced an absolutely humiliating and devastating defeat. Let me clarify that. The white South had experienced that. The Black South won, although it would take another 100 years to benefit from that. And the process still isn't complete. But the white South lost in this humiliating fashion. And over a period of a few decades, there developed this ideology. It was almost one historian has called it a civic religion. It does have this air of the religious about it, of religious commemoration and memory and celebrating sacrifice. And the idea was that, well, maybe the South's cause wasn't totally defensible, but the people who actually fought the war, people like Taskmaster and the ancestors of these women, they were doing it out of a sense of honor and duty and friendship with their neighbors and devotion to their own state. And there was something heroic and noble and self-sacrificing about this, and we can't let it go unnoticed. So we're going to change these names. We're going to put these names of our Civil War heroes on streets, buildings, schools, colleges, whatever. We're going to erect these monuments in virtually every Southern city and town. We're going to do Monument Avenue in Richmond, which is on a very grand scale, indeed. And we're going to savor and honor and preserve their memory forever. And so that is when this happens. And by a bizarre and chilling coincidence, it's also happening in the years that the real segregationist laws are going into effect, the Jim Crow laws across the South. So the two things aren't unrelated, but it's definitely something that goes back to the historic period, I'd say roughly 1880, 1930. Although there were some more monuments put up in the 1960s as a response to a negative response to the civil rights movement across the South. Let's see, some more questions. Why do you think Robert Penn Warren ended up in New England? Well, you should ask John Burt and Ernest Suarez that tomorrow. They will have the details. I assumed it was because he was offered such a good job at Yale and had remarried by that point, as you heard yesterday. And, you know, he had a kind of sentimental attachment to his agrarian friends and colleagues, I think. But, you know, by the time he left Nashville, he went off to Berkeley first, then he went off to Oxford, and he taught at several other places. He ended up at LSU for about a decade. But then he went north and stayed there. And I think he felt very much at home. And Yale had a fabulous English department, as it still does. And he became very good friends with people like Harold Bloom, who was a great admirer of his poetry. So there was something maybe inevitable about the transition, but we can find out more tomorrow when we have the real biographical experts here. Another question is, does the Castmaster episode indicate any guilt on Warren's part? I would, off the top of my head, say no. I think as I said before, he doesn't come from that deep South cotton kingdom plantation society. I think he, to some degree, holds it against Jack Burton that he does. It's ironic, of course, that Willie Stark from the impoverished backwoods, piney woods, he hires Jack Burton, you know, the scion of the planter aristocracy, to work for him, and in turn, you know, he buys his soul, really, and at least up to a point. So in Warren's case, I don't think he felt guilt. I think he felt an enduring interest in the history of the South, though. He writes about Jeff Davis. He also writes about John Brown. He writes, the legacy, a book called The Legacy of the Civil War. It's a subject that I don't think comes up very much in his poetry, and please ask John Burt more about this tomorrow. But it certainly, it appears in his fiction. He writes another Civil War, at least one more Civil War novel, and maybe some plays. So the quick answer would be probably no, but it's a subject of abiding concern. And one final question, as we begin to run out of time here. Does Robert Penn Warren's work express a distrust of the self-righteous idealist prone to violence? Okay, sorry. A distrust of the self-righteous idealist prone to violence. How does this position arise from Southern heritage? Well, the South has always been a violent part. I mean, the United States is a violent place, but the South particularly so. It was part of the cult of male masculinity that you had to, if you were rich, you fought duels, and if you were poor, you scratched people, gouged people's eyeballs out in brutal hand-to-hand wrestling matches, which were a great form of entertainment across the South. It was a great, there's a wonderful essay a historian wrote about grabbing people by the nose. Apparently that was one of the most insulting things you could do to another Southerner, rich or poor, to grab him by the nose. I don't know, maybe it's some psychological reason for that, but it was a way of challenging someone to either a duel or one of these bare knuckle fights. And I suppose if you travel through the Old South, you saw people missing an eyeball, missing all their front teeth, missing some fingers or feet or whatever, because there was this tradition of barely controlled violence that was just part of everyday life, and this way of asserting that you were a full-grown man. And the southernness, the prickliness, the eagerness to go to war in 1861, particularly in hot-headed cultures such as that of white South Carolina, it's all a historical record. So yes, there is a large degree of self-righteousness to some people who might think of themselves as idealist, and there is certainly a great prone to resort to violence at the first opportunity. And I think this endures. I mean, think of all the civil rights workers who were either killed or brutalized in one way or another. Think of the things that go on today in many Southern towns. I mean, I have to say a lot has changed. I don't want to be so totally negative. An enormous amount has changed. And in many ways, it is a biracial society. And I think it needs to be more of one, but the changes are slow in coming. And I think George Shipley tomorrow will have a lot to say about this, of how these things are impacting on Southern politics and Texas politics, particularly in this election year. So on that note, I would just remind you that we will meet again 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon to hear from George. And then at 5, we'll have the final panel of all the speakers, a chance to ask any questions you have left over, anything you think of tonight or in the morning, and to make any final parting shot of your own. So again, thanks for listening to this. And please do think about Cass Mastern and what his story means in the greater context of the novel and of our own lives today. So have a good evening.